Today, I have the chance to talk with Sue Bronson in this series called In Their Voices. Sue and I have known each other for a while and have been friends and colleagues. And um, one of the things that has always impressed me and interested me about Sue and why I wanted to talk with you, Sue, is because although you've been a practitioner for a very long time, both in your therapy practice and as a mediator, you don't rest on sort of the familiar known. You're you're always pushing things a little bit, trying to figure out how you can take what you know and apply it in fresh ways. And the work that, as an example of that, the work that you're doing in elder care coordination um, is a marvelous example of exactly that. But today we're going to talk about other things. We're going to
Okay,
talk about screening, I guess, right?
right.
Great. So talk to me about your interest in and your concern with screening. And then I'm sure that I'll have a bunch of questions as I listen to you.
Uh, So I have been involved in the ABA, American Bar Association task force on creating a screening tool for elder mediators. And the discussions in that group have been fascinating to me in how some people don't want to screen. And I'm like, what? So I have found that there are some people. And the screening tools for elder mediation, but we also need to screen in family mediation, workplace, and other things. The purpose of a screening tool is to screen, to find out what's there. And we cannot possibly know. None of us know. Even if we heard about one piece of abuse or mistreatment, there may be others that we don't even know about because nobody's asked. They hooked on to that one piece and ignored the rest. So I think screening is vitally important so that we get the big overview of the family dynamics and to see if we should even be mediating in this case.
So
Go ahead.
if you could connect that to a particular dispute, hypothetical or real case situation, so that we can understand why the screening tool, and maybe you were going to come to that, and if so, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but that's to, to, to show how important it is from a practical point of view. It isn't just a conceptual idea,
Right.
but it is more. It's a practical tool.
It's a practical tool, one piece, as I said, to learn about mistreatment in the family. And you know, Michael, that if you ask people, have you been abused? People would say no, although they've been strangled, a gun has been put to their head 27 times, like all kinds of things happen, and people don't identify for themselves that it's abuse. So we need to ask questions that open up about who do you feel comfortable with? Who do you not feel comfortable with? What do you wish was different? Uh, what makes getting along with this person easy or difficult? And when we know more about those dynamics, and I haven't asked real probing questions yet, I'm just asking big overview questions about what's it like to be you. And when I ask those questions, I can find out more about the dynamics so that one, I can determine whether or not we should even mediate. Two, how to set up the mediation. Do I need to be in the same room? Do I need to be in two rooms? Do I need to have um, separate arrival and departure times? Or accommodations for disabilities? Do I need to be on the first floor where there's no stairs? Or do I need um, good lighting or less lighting? I mean, so on really practical level of the accommodations, but also so that I can understand the family. Because that these disputes are not about the legal issues. The disputes are about how I feel unseen by you that you don't see who I am and therefore you don't understand me. And if we don't ask the questions, the mediator will be one more person who doesn't understand. Even though you may reflect back the words, you haven't gotten to that deeper place of this is where I'm coming from.
So, in particular, you want to talk with the elder person.
Everybody. I want to talk with everybody.
Okay. And what sort of questions do you ask? Let's take the elder person first, and then maybe there are different questions that you would ask of other family members. But let's just start with one.
So, actually, can I start backwards?
Of course.
Because usually you would want to talk to the family members first. They tend to have good capacity, and they're the ones that are up in arms about what's happening. So I want to get their perspectives first. So I would ask, what are your concerns? And if you start there, you will get a lot of information. Um, I would also want to ask, in a sense, how much do they know that person? So, what is day to day life like for their parent or sister or whoever this elder may be? I want to ask about social isolation. So, I want to ask how often they see the person, how often they call or have contact with the person, and what that contact looks like. Um, I want to find out, is this a person who has all the day to day information, or is this the person from far away who only hears it over the phone and makes assumptions along the way? And then go to the elder at the end so that with the elder, I can ask, how's your day going for you? What kind of help do you get? If you wanted to purchase something, do you have the money to do that? Do you think there's enough money for your care? Um, what kind of care are you receiving? Are there people who you enjoy being around? So they're broad, general questions, but I'm actually asking about 5 different areas of abuse.
You want to list the five?
Sure.
Great.
Um, there would be physical abuse. And I think when most people think about abuse, they think about the physical abuse, like you're going to see bruises. But we know older people can bruise if you just touch their skin. They can be so frail or have such blood thinners that they can bruise easily. So physical abuse would be one area. Emotional or psychological abuse, that would be the things like name calling or cornering someone into a spot where they feel like they can't make decisions for themselves and they rely on others. They become subservient to that person. Sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and self neglect.
Okay. And you ask these sets of questions of the participants, it seems, for two broad reasons. One, it helps you create a process taking into account who the people are, how they interact with one another, and what their needs might be.
Right,
And also, it begins to give you additional clues about the substantive issues that will need to be addressed.
right.
Yeah.
And I believe that many mediators feel like it's intrusive to ask these questions. And I would agree if you asked a lot of follow up questions, but these are just high level questions to get an idea of what's happening. Even if you ask a very pinpointed, direct question, people can lie. People don't tell the truth all the time. But if we're warm and inviting, people open up and are eager to tell others about what's going on for them.
So let me pick up on that one thing, if I may. So if I'm not interrupting,
You're
okay.
good.
Um, you've just identified a third reason. In addition to process and content, by having those screening interviews, you're beginning to build a working relationship
Yes.
with the parties
Yeah.
so that they have a measure of confidence in you as
Yes.
a professional who is going to pay attention to them and help them solve some thorny problems.
Right. Right. And some people are talkers and they may need more time to tell their story. And other people tend to give one word answers or they said it in a sentence and they're done now. So these can be different likes as well. But listening to what they want is the answer to how long it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, so what's the tension about whether to employ these kinds of screening techniques and tools? Where's the tension about whether to do this or not?
So, what I heard from some people in this task force, it felt intrusive. They thought that family members would shut down and walk away and would never meet at the table. Um, they thought it was either none of our business or it was beyond our role. And I agree with many of those pieces. What I don't agree with is that you can avoid asking the questions. It's not an assessment as adult protective services would be. We are not trying to get the full story. What we want is the overview, the big picture about the dynamics within the family,
Mhm.
um, where those tensions are, just so that we know and we can be on the lookout for them and see when we said something or when it's coming up and we know that we might need to probe a little bit more during the mediation. So some people feel like it's too intrusive. Some people feel like we're going beyond our role, our boundaries. Um, and I think that it's possible for people to do those, but you have to ask the questions or you haven't done a screening.
So is part of the problem the skill in being able to ask these questions
Yes,
the level that doesn't cross those boundaries that people are concerned about?
right. So some people who were very skilled say, well, I just have a conversation. That sounds great, but we know that airplane pilots and emergency room doctors, even though they've done these procedures many, many times, they still go through a checklist um, because you can forget something so easily. And so I think asking in each of these areas is important. And if you just have a conversation, you may miss one of those areas.
So the point is you can do it in a conversational way,
Absolutely.
right? That's stylistic
Yes.
as distinct from substantive.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And some people stylistically have a harder time with that relationship building. And so it comes across, no matter how well worded the question is, it will come across as one more item on the checklist.
Yeah. Or an interrogation.
Right, right. So it's about how do you connect with people so that it doesn't feel intrusive when you ask these questions because you gauge the level and the timing right. It's oftentimes a follow up to what they've asked or said.
So in talking with your colleagues on the task force, do they appreciate and acknowledge the overriding concerns that the screening tool is intended to address?
My personal opinion would be not everybody does. So some people think that somebody else did a screening and have already screened them out. I don't trust that screening that somebody else did. So I need to do my own screening and I might get different information than somebody else got.
Right. And as you've acknowledged, the purpose for doing the screening isn't just to figure out what the issues are.
Right. Right.
It is to determine suitability.
Yeah.
And if there are questions about suitability, can they be resolved through structuring the process in a way that allows people to participate in a mediation with appropriate structures, support, whatever it might be.
Safeguards. So, of course, we need to have safeguards in place. Uh, and what that is for different people are different. It depends in part about your surroundings. It depends in part about um, what type of a center or firm or agency that you choose to be, who you choose to serve, what the safety policies and precautions in the building are, as well as among colleagues.
Right. You know, as I was preparing and thinking about our conversation today, Sue, I was remembering how much this, or was reminded how much this seems like the conversation almost, what is it, 25 years ago
Domestic violence.
on domestic violence. And can mediation ever be successfully implemented if there have been incidents of domestic abuse or domestic violence?
Right. I just yesterday talked to somebody who said, nope, can never be done. Like, gee, I've done a lot. uh, so it's the how. It's not a yes no answer.
Right. And back then, as those of us who believed or who at least wanted to consider the possibility of using mediation in those settings, we were met with people who were fierce and articulate and deeply caring advocates
Yes.
for victims of domestic abuse who were concerned about protecting the people who had been abused and not having them re-abused.
Right.
And it's not that those challenges were ultimately overcome completely, but we seem to have found an effective balance, um, so that mediation isn't indiscriminately used in cases of domestic abuse, nor is it automatically screened out as,
Correct.
as a process.
And it's similar to social justice issues today. We have to be woke to what the issues are. If we don't see it, we can't see it. And then once we see it, we need to know, what difference does it make? Like, what's the nature of it? And how is this one different than the last one? And then what is our role there, so that we have that in our mind? It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to do any particular thing, but we have to have it in our awareness in order to plan for that dynamic, whether it's social justice, domestic violence, or elder abuse.
Yeah. In the conversations you've had on the task force, and I'm not asking you obviously to talk about individuals or to reveal anything that's in any way um, should be private in those
Yeah.
conversations. But I'm wondering whether people have, on all sides of the conversation, have talked about specific practice situations, actual implementation of elder care mediation or elder care coordination. Have they used specific examples and said, well, let me describe, this is what happened exactly, and has have you had those kinds of conversations as well?
Um, Not so much in this specific case this happened, but we would often bring up situations. Uh, like, sometimes family members don't want to be in the same room, but it's just because you have different values. Like, there's no abuse. You simply have different values, and I don't want to talk with them.
Right.
And other times, there's a reason I don't want to be in the room with them. I don't feel safe being in a room with them. And I need some safeguards put into place. And then we can talk about what those safeguards are. I don't need to know the whole background story. I simply need to know what safeguards could we create so that we can have the conversation.
Yeah, and you're not taking sides either by trying to create
Right,
safeguards and saying, of course, this happened to you, and oh my God, we're not. Right.
right.
does the conversation ever touch on safeguards for the mediator?
Absolutely. So mediators have to have their paperwork in order, like your policies, your professional service agreement, um, your system of how and where you work, so that things are thought through ahead of time. Can we think of every situation? No. I always say policies are written after an incident happened.
That's right.
Because now we know.
That's right. Always.
Yes.
You do your best to imagine the situation and then you learn from new experiences.
Right. And who ever would have thought of that situation? But now that you've had that situation, you say, okay, so what impact will this have on how I practice?
You know, I had a, like you, I've been mediating for decades. And I did a divorce mediation not long ago. And um, typical to my way of working, I had conversations in advance by phone with the parties. Not so much to understand the issues, but to get a sense of who they were and let them ask me any questions about my credentials and about mediation and so on. So we set up the initial meeting, and they turned up with three of their six children.
Oh,
Yes, 3, 5, and 8.
oh,
And that was that challenged me. I'd never in decades, I'd never had anything like that happen. So the question is, do I now start writing do I have to write a policy that says children don't come to mediation unless there is a mutual agreement among all of us that they will be present?
yeah.
Yeah. So,
And then even if you have that policy, I've certainly had people that said, my babysitter didn't show up, or um, school was closed today for
right.
some reason. And so now they have these kids and they don't know what to do. So we have to be quick thinking on our feet. If kids are around, what are we going to do?
Right. And I had to improvise in that situation to make plans for the children. There was no separate room for them to go to, unfortunately. So
Oh,
we, the three adults, huddled while the children. It was a very large room, fortunately. While the children, we found uh, pens and pencils and paper, and they could draw, and they'd learned. The older one was learning to do origami, and you know, eh, yeah, you improvise because
right,
I don't blame the parents for that.
right.
As it happened, their explanation, I won't say excuse, their explanation was that they didn't have a babysitter.
Exactly. And that happens a lot.
Yeah. So,
People are unreliable.
yeah, but I just had no experience doing that as such. So, again, do
I've,
you,
I've had many experiences doing that. And,
I
and
should have called you.
one piece is your kids were old enough that um, at least the 3 and the 5-year-old had, I forgot what you said the older one was. You had somebody that could look out over them a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's harder when you have the 3-year-old by themselves, or the infant in the bassinet. Is that what it's called? The
Hmm.
car carrier?
Right.
Um, because I believe even if that baby is sleeping, they know what's going on and they affect the process.
They
Uh,
do. And the parent's attention is drawn away as
yeah,
well.
as
So,
well as mine. I mean, that cute little baby. You think I
yeah,
can ignore that?
well, and my attention as well. Um, yeah, it happened that uh, 2 days later was going to be my birthday. So I told the kids that, and they were busy then making birthday cards. It was one of the things that kept them occupied. It was fine in the end, but it is challenging. And so um, you're right. Having as many policies as you can is useful and never a complete answer
Right.
because we're human beings.
Right. And the same is true when you're screening. it's not that you hear an answer and you have an immediate yes no answer about whether you should continue with the mediation. The question is this the case for mediation, but I'm the wrong mediator? Or if it does continue to go to mediation, what would the safeguards need to be, or how would the process need to make room for those dynamics that we now know about,
Right.
or the information we now have?
Yeah, because I liken our work to, in terms of the stories that we hear, a little bit like movie trailers. You know, they give you a fair amount of information, but they don't reveal everything.
Right.
The people who've come to you have had a lifetime of engagement with one another. They have extraordinary histories. We don't know very much about those histories. And the more we can learn, the better we are at being able to figure out how to be useful to them.
And in family mediation meeting, parents around child care, that we're generally talking about 20 to 30-year-olds who have known each other only a few years. When
Right.
we're talking about elder caring coordination, we're talking about people who have practiced these dynamics for 60 years. They know each other really well. They know how to poke at that soft underbelly. Or, as a friend of mine said, who do you think installed those buttons? The parents installed those buttons. So the parents are part of that dynamic.
Right.
They're not always that sweet, vulnerable, frail elder. They can be strong-willed, determined, um, nasty people like the rest of us can be.
Right. Yeah. And so even though you do all of the screening, you can still be surprised.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you do the screening, you have a foundation on which to adjust based on that surprise. Whereas without the screening, you're in free fall.
Right. Or you chose not to take the case, which is perfectly okay. It's better suited to somebody else. Just like if a case has a lot of legal nuance, I'm not the right mediator. Send it to somebody who would be a much better mediator.
Sure.
Let's work together.
Is there ever, in the conversations that you've had, has there ever been consideration about, well, this is going to just, it takes more time, therefore it's going to cost more money? Is that a concern as well?
Um, I have not heard that.
Good.
Uh, and part of that is when does the clock start ticking?
Mhm.
When do you start uh, charging for the services? So in my local family court, we do an evaluation session or that screening session for free so that everybody can learn about mediation and see if their situation would go forward with this particular mediator or ask for another mediator. In elder caring coordination, there's a lot of family members, and there can also be a lot of distrust of the system or distrust of another intruder
Mhm.
coming into those dynamics. Um, so there may be pushback that they don't want us to come in. Um, they want to keep the system a closed system, or somebody else is exposing the family, and that's not okay. Yeah. So I don't see time and money as the biggest issue, and I think it's that we have to be efficient with our time.
Yeah. So let me go back to something that I'm also wondering about, and that is whether, as you've had the conversations about the use of a screening protocol or screening questionnaire, um, whether one of the things that you begin to notice is that people have different ideas about what a mediator is, does, what mediation is, what its purpose is for, and so on.
Yes, yes. And very different views on the purpose, the role, the worldview.
Yeah, because I think that makes it that it's to me it's actually a very interesting place to go to have a conversation, to talk about our beliefs, our values, the principles, the assumptions that we make about our work, because it helps illuminate where the origin of our differences lie.
Right.
Um,
And I would say that the task force meetings were illuminating. And so that we could come up with a tool that I think for the most part people can be proud of.
and how far along in the process is the task force?
So we have a tool that needs to be piloted. Um, it is not up on any website yet. It should be soon. So that's the next step. We're cleaning up little pieces. We're making some pieces bigger so you can read it, and some pieces smaller to make it clearer.
Mhm. When do you expect that will be available? You have any idea?
I have learned that my expectations are not realistic.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. And have you, is there a sense about how the pilot, the testing of the instrument would be done, and where and would be done, and so on?
So um, the goal is to get as many people as possible to use it and provide feedback to us. That we know that the first draft is not the best draft. It is a place to begin.
Mhm.
And then we'll find out, was that a question that most people had a reaction to and we should eliminate it or find another way to ask it? Or were we thinking that X amount of time frame would be adequate and it's not? So I think we just need to find what people's experiences are. And does it uncover the abuse or mistreatment?
So you're not going to do a research project as such. It's more ad hoc and trying to get as many colleagues and practitioners to be able to utilize the instrument.
If you know of a researcher who would like to take it on, we would be open to that. But in the meantime, we will have practitioners use it and give us feedback.
Yeah, because I think that's, I think one of the things that we as practitioners don't realize is that we are in and of ourselves researchers.
Yes.
We are gathering data all the time when we try an intervention, or an approach, or a protocol, questionnaire. Um, yeah, but it sounds as though that's the next step after you do
Right.
some refinement, then perhaps to do something more formal
Right.
with research.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you said something really important, Michael, is so our behaviors have an effect. And then trying to figure out how come that effect happened. Was it a good question, but I didn't ask it well? Did I ask it at the wrong time, wrong pace? Did I not build up enough of a relationship first? Or was I just not at my best today? And then this question may be effective with a lot of people, but it just wasn't effective with George or Sally on this day.
Right.
Right.
And not just to um, berate ourselves or
Right.
criticize ourselves for the fact, but to use that as a way of saying, huh, why didn't that work? It worked with the three previous mediations. It should have worked here. It
Yes.
didn't. What's going on?
Right. And that's and I thank you for all the self-reflection is unless we take the time to look at our part in the dynamic, then we become blamers. We blame the people that we're serving. And I don't think that sets up a good dynamic. I think we need to check our neutrality, check our part of the interaction.
Mhm.
Where could we do better next time? Where do I need to learn more? Where do I need to consult with others? Where do I need to get good ideas? I remember that this, for me, brings up a particular case where a psychologist, so someone who knew a lot about the importance of screening and how to talk to families, um, he was consulting with me about the case, and he said, almost as a throwaway sentence, "Yeah, they're talking about it as domestic violence." And I'm like, "Yes, power and control. I see that right here." He goes, "Really?" I said, "Yes." And in elder families, there can be um, that the system gets repeated down the generations.
Mhm.
And so the dispute may be at one generation, but it gets played out in a different generation. The wrong people are having the fight sometimes.
Yeah. Well, it's sometimes, I mean, that's why I sometimes like to use systems thinking as a way, because it helps me remember to not focus on the symptom.
Right,
The
right,
person who is identified as, if it weren't for so and so, then everything would be okay.
right.
But to see it as the entire system interacting, each person in the system interacting with one another and influencing each other.
So we talked about domestic violence, and 25 years ago, I think it was 30 years ago, in Wisconsin, we had a meeting with mediators and domestic violence advocates so we could learn from one another. And we did a role play where the abuser was the most logical, level headed charmer, uh, and I was kind of hysterical and reactionary as the one who was suffering from that domination and control. So I didn't fit the mold of that meek, mild
Mhm.
victim. What I was instead is I didn't like what was happening and I was mouthing off because this was a place that I thought I could speak up, but I looked um, like you wouldn't want to believe me because I was so reactionary. That role play really stood out for me all these years later as teaching me so much about first impressions.
Mhm. You know, I think that we underplay as trainers and educators, we underplay that aspect of the role plays, that we don't enough pay attention to the role players and what they are learning about about mediation process and about the role of the mediator from being in the role of the party.
So, one of the questions I ask as a trainer is, did the mediator do something that made a shift inside of you as one of the parties that never came out in words, but that made a shift inside of you about how you saw things or how you wanted to respond to things? So I
It's
think as trainers, it's our responsibility to ask good questions.
yeah, it's a powerful question. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. Sue, I'm just wondering, um, is there any question that you would have wanted me to ask you about the development of the screening instrument and its application and its value?
Um, One piece is because it took much longer than I thought, it is based on research. Like we didn't just come up with things, we didn't just grab from other tools, because there are a lot of tools for screening out there, but they're meant for other people. So a doctor can check the health. As a mediator, that's not our role. Um, or adult protective services needs to drill down. That's not our role. So we had to look at both what do we know about risk factors, signs of abuse, and examples of abuse, and then what as a mediator would we observe or hear so that we bring that down to in our role what's likely to happen. And therefore, the end result of the questions we ask are based on that research,
Mhm.
that slow process of
Right.
researching why we're doing what we're doing.
Because it seems to me as I'm listening to you that, and to go back to a question I asked originally that you did answer, um, but but also comes up, which is you and I and most of the people who will watch this video are practitioners.
Yeah.
And probably like you, when someone talks to me about an idea, one of my thoughts is, so what? Not in a challenging way, but in a way that says, what difference is this likely to make tomorrow in my practice? How will it help me be a better mediator? How will it help me better serve the interests of the parties I'm working with?
So, in developing a tool, not only for our own use, but for others' use, it's not only what do I need to know, what do I need to pay attention to for my practice, but your practice, and I don't know what that is like.
Mhm.
How you are going to ask the question, and I don't know your ability to ask good questions. Um, I always tell my students that you have to have a good question, but more importantly, you have to have good follow up questions.
Right.
That you need to know what question to ask after you get that answer, because that's where things begin to open up more. You go, oh, now what?
Right.
And
And,
how
and
many questions do we list for those follow ups, and how much do we let people make it up on your own?
yeah, it seems to me that in addition to the instrument, then it's going to be important for people to understand not just what it is and how it's used, but why.
Yes.
Because if they understand why and they um, adopt that mindset, then they'll figure out what those follow-up questions are likely to be because they already understand that follow-up questions are necessary.
Yes. Without crossing that line of doing an assessment,
Right.
because as mediators, we are not doing assessments.
No.
We let the psychologist do assessments. We let the adult protective services or child protective services do those sorts of assessments. We just need to open up and find out enough of the dynamics to know if they can mediate with us.
Yeah, that's great. So, is there anything else you want to say? This has been a remarkable conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. It's always fun to chat with you because you do ask good follow up questions.
Thank you. And one of the follow up questions I may be asking is once that protocol is public and begins to be used, maybe we can have another conversation like that and talk about how it's developing and what the reactions and the responses are that will help make whatever adjustments and improvements are necessary to it.
Sure. And we'll also maybe put a link at the end about how you can get the tool once it's up.
Pardon me. Absolutely. If by the time this video is published, that's available, we'll include it. If not, we can easily add it to the
Okay.
video later, or somehow make sure that it's broadly publicized.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue.
You're welcome. Thanks for thinking of me, Michael.
Yeah.